Has the Sea Shepherd organization been successful in using direct action as a way for conservation? That's going to be the subject matter for today's episode. We have Sarah Levy, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Oxford. During her master's, she did an entire master's thesis on the Sea Shepherd and how direct action can actually turn into environmental enforcement using law. We're going to be talking about the book, The Only Flag Worth Flying, which is the product of Sarah's master's, and co-authored with Captain Paul Watson. Now, I've never had Captain Paul Watson on this episode, but we're going to hear from Sarah what the misconceptions people have of him. And we're also going to hear how direct action, conservation action that Sea Shepherd and the Paul Watson Foundation has actually taken, and if it was successful and how it become so successful. We're going to dive into all that on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, marine biologist and science communicator, here to tell you what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we're going to be talking to Sarah Levy, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. She's doing her PhD on something completely different, which we're going to have her on for because she's talking about the Canadian seal hunt and how environmental law can be associated with that. We're going to talk all about that on a different episode. On today's episode, we're going to be focusing on direct conservation action, like the type of stuff the Sea Shepherd does. And we're going to be using Sea Shepherd as an example, talking about the different ways over its history how it's used direct action, like trying to stop the whale hunt in the Southern Ocean by ramming boats or by getting in the way of the seal hunt ships from Japan. We're also going to be talking about how it observes and tracks and works with Interpol to catch illegal fishing boats. And we're going to talk all about that and how enforcement really works when after you catch these fisheries ships and illegal fishing boats, and then what happens after that, who gets charged, how they get charged, can they get charged, what companies are involved, is organized crime involved, all that wonderful stuff. It's kind of crazy. It gets into the weeds, but Sarah's here to give us all the help that we need. If you want to know more about how the law and enforcement works within conservation and marine conservation, this is the episode for you today. So here's the interview with Sarah Levy talking about her new book, The Only Flag Worth Flying, co-authored with Captain Paul Watson. Enjoy the interview, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Sarah, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about the law and the sea?
Absolutely.
Right? Oh, this is a lot of fun for me because we got a fellow Ontarian here. So 2 Ontarians on the call, but you're living abroad, which is so cool. And you have so much experience with environmental law and the sea. And I think it's a conversation that we don't really get to talk about a lot on this podcast. And just in general, I find, we talk a lot about designating protected areas, designated fisheries laws, and every country has their own type of fisheries laws and protection laws and species at risk laws and things like that. But a lot of the times, unfortunately, they're not enforced as well because there's challenges, a number of different challenges to try and enforce the sea. It's a big place. It's hard to get to. You can't have as many boats as you want, and people are sneaky, and that could be a difficult thing to do. But we have a lot of hope ahead of us. We have the High Seas Treaty that's coming through, or that's just been enacted. We have a lot of international fisheries stuff going on. We have a lot of exclusive economic zone laws within each country that's happening. And Sarah, you are here to talk about law and enforcement, and in general, and just sort of what the barriers are. We're gonna have a great conversation on that. But before we get into all that stuff, let's just talk about who you are and get to know you a little bit. So why don't you just let us know, Sarah, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me, Andrew. And,
you bet.
Yeah, it's great to be chatting as well with another Canadian, but I must clarify that I'm not an Ontarian. I'm
Yeah.
proudly a Manitoban.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought you were in Ontario, Manitoba. Okay. All right on.
Yeah. I'm from Winnipeg originally, but
Nice.
I studied in Toronto for several years. So I did my undergrad at U of T and my law degree at Osgoode Hall at York University. And
Nice.
I've always specialized in environmental law. And I worked for the Ministry of the Environment within Ontario for a short time after I graduated before starting my PhD, which is what I'm currently doing in Oxford in sociolegal studies. And My project for the PhD specifically focuses on seal hunting in Canada and
Oh, wow.
largely unpacking the differences between the East Coast fishery and the Inuit sealing that occurs in the Arctic, and looking at the trade laws that surround that,
Hmm.
particularly the EU trade ban.
Right.
But what we're mostly going to be talking about today is the book, which is based on my master's thesis, which was focusing more on the international law side of things. But
Hmm.
marine mammal protection is something that I've, yeah, always been interested in from both an academic and personal perspective.
Of course.
I'm a scuba diver. I love the sea. I love the ocean. So yeah, there's many things that draw me to this.
Yeah, and like I mean, going just we'll talk just a little bit about it, but obviously the seal hunt in Canada is very controversial. For it's been for decades. It's gotten international. I guess it's notorious internationally in terms of people speaking out against it. It's obviously I'm a marine biologist. It's never nice to see the way they hunt the seals. It looks brutal. It looks awful. According to the science, it's the best way to do it. But regardless, it's always a bad look, and it's been a blemish on Canadian society and reputation for a long time. And there's always the complexities, and I'm so happy you're looking into this because I was actually having a conversation with a friend of mine. I was like, we haven't heard about the seal hunt in a long time. Doesn't mean it stopped. It's just we
No.
just haven't heard about it, and it's just because maybe not. Maybe there's other things going on. Maybe things have gotten better. Maybe things haven't gotten better. You're the person to talk to, and maybe after your PhD, we'll have a full conversation on that. But I love how you distinguish between the Inuit hunt and the Canadian hunt. That's obviously a very important aspect because Indigenous rights is a huge issue that's continuing to develop and people are paying attention to it. So it's really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing the results of your PhD and what you come. So right off the bat, I'd love to invite you back to talk
Thank you so
about that.
much. Yeah.
But we're gonna talk about the book today because it's called "The Only Flag Worth Flying." And what really caught me, I have a master's, and my master's is technically, quote unquote, a book. It's sitting on a shelf at Acadia University, but it's not a book that everybody will read or that I'll like sell or things like that, because it's like for me it's like a book that I did my master's on. I got it done, and you just have it on your shelf and you hope like that's it. But this one is really interesting because like you're giving it to the people. You're saying, hey, look, like here's what we need to be doing when it comes to basically direct action, right, and taking action on the high seas internationally, and what we can do about it. Because Sarah, can you just define how internet, just like the international seas, like the high seas, and how like why it's so difficult to govern in the high seas?
Yeah, so the high seas is basically the majority of the oceans in our world because this is what extends beyond the territorial borders, beyond the exclusive economic zones of each country. So the high seas is, in many regards, seen as a bit of a no man's land from a legal perspective because it's beyond the area of national jurisdiction, but it's also an area that's incredibly vast and, far and away the majority. So.
Yeah, for sure. Now, when it comes to applying law internationally, it's almost like before the High Seas Treaty, and even then we still don't know what that is going to come of because it's so new. It just came in January 27th, 2020, or January 17th, 2027. It's difficult to apply law to the high seas. It's pretty much the Wild West, if you will,
Yeah.
right now. People can do whatever they want, and nobody can really say anything about it, other than countries looking down on each other for trying to do something, right? If somebody tries to do something that they shouldn't be ethically, right? Is that
Absolutely.
sort of the case right now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There
Okay.
are, in certain situations, there have been attempts to regulate certain areas of the high seas. For example, designating the Southern Ocean as a sanctuary. But designating something as a sanctuary does not go very far if that area is not actually, protected, patrolled in that regard. So it's one of these things that, you know, technically does exist, but
Mm-hmm.
those
Mm-hmm.
designations are very much in name only. So
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So now, so now we have this sort of like this definition of like sort of the high seas and how difficult it is to apply the law. You're doing your master's and you have a book that comes out. What do you want people to get out of this book that they can kind of take home and just be like, oh, okay, like they can get a good understanding of sort of the is it the challenges? Is that what you want people to get to understand?
yeah, so initially with this book, coming out of my master's thesis, the idea was basically to do three things. Two of those things, which the master's thesis did, and the third of those things being something that was unique to the book that I added in through the writing process. So the first thing is to really provide a very clear overview of international law and international environmental law, and what is this landscape that we're operating in vis-a-vis protecting the high seas. And that's the first part of the book, called, which is referred to as soundings, and that's really the kind of foundational aspect, probably the most academic aspect, and one that from the perspective of a reader, you could almost think of it as that's the sort of textbook part of the
Mm-hmm.
book. But
Right,
then
right.
but then the second thing that the book does is it traces sort of the currents of direct action, of activism on the high seas, and situates that in terms of legal legitimacy. Because the core argument that I was making in my master's thesis through the use of three case studies involving, at the time, Sea Shepherd, was when they acted either as a quasi state actor, as an independent actor, or even in turn with Interpol to enforce laws that already exist, to some degree in the high seas, and just demonstrating their efficacy, and to some degree showing that that efficacy confers a certain legal legitimacy. That
Mm-hmm.
while these groups may be sort of branded as being vigilantes or
Yeah.
derided as pirates, that
Mm-hmm.
that's actually in some way a degradation of what they do, because they've proven themselves to be the most effective legal actor, and also not acting out of bounds in terms of the fact that none of these groups have ever harmed an individual. They use mostly property damage as their tactics. But yeah, we can talk more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when we talk about Sea Shepherd as a whole, especially previous, because Sea Shepherd has gone through changes. Captain Paul Watson is not associated with some Sea Shepherd. I don't know the whole intricacies. I know recently that that's changed, and he started his own foundation.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's been really interesting to see the Sea Shepherd be able to go out in international waters as part of like this whole lawlessness, and to go out and affect pressure on countries, which was highly documented through the Whale Wars TV show. I think that a lot of people saw, where they were, putting pressure on the Japanese whaling fleet, where eventually, you could argue that it was because of them that Japan pretty much stopped whaling in the Southern Ocean. I think you
Yeah.
can pretty much attribute to that. They
Yeah.
had, Sea Shepherd had aggressive ways. They rammed ships, and they got in their way, because that was really some of the only things they could do. I think they had water cannons. They were getting water cannons. Like it's dangerous. It could have been dangerous for a lot of people. I think some of the boats got sunk. Like some of their Sea Shepherd's boats got sunk at times. And it's very controversial, and I totally understand where some of the things that when people look at that, especially from the conservation community, I think I've said it before too. It's like people look at them like as a violent conservation organization when you look at it from the overview, but then when you look at what they've been able to do and be able to accomplish, at some points you're just like, oh wow, like they drove off an entire country from international whaling, which has been going on for decades.
Yeah,
And then
absolutely.
we're a country that was able to convince other smaller countries at the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, to vote against the moratorium for whaling. It's just they've gone through, like a country that like Japan had gone through a lot of lengths to try and overturn that moratorium on, like, that ban essentially on whaling. And here is a Sea Shepherd, you could say was a small organization at the time, being like, no, we're not going to stand for it. We're actually going to physically be there because nobody else is going to do it. And we're going to make sure that we drive off the people. You have to give credit where credit's due to the Sea Shepherd. And then I feel like it's over the last decade, you can correct me if I'm wrong because you know more than I do, but it seems like over the last decade, maybe more, they've really gone after fishing, like international fishing and illegal international fishing,
Yeah.
where you see videos of them following boats, and then and making sure they know if they go to port, they're going to alert the authorities and be able to be like, hey, by the way, they were in the wrong area and they're illegally fishing. They might have fishery slaves on that boat. They might have a lot of stuff going on. On this ship that they've been following, and they've been able to capture a lot of these illegal fishers in these ships that are fishing. So you're kind of like, oh wow, they're really doing the work, for them. But they're also a small organization trying to operate on a large sea, and they can only do what they can do. But they're bringing attention to the issue. On a worldwide perspective, people see this and be like, oh wow, they're really doing the great work.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
From your work with Sea Shepherd, and this book is is it a co-author with Captain Paul Watson? Is that how that's how it's termed, right? Because it says Sarah Levy with Captain Paul Watson.
Yeah.
From your work and dealings with Paul Watson, as well as Sea Shepherd and his organization, what is your what do you see? You're in, you've seen you talked about it, working with Interpol, what is it that people don't get? Like myself, who's not in the circles, what is it that we don't get that you admire about the work that's been done by not only Sea Shepherd, but just by Paul Watson in general?
Yeah, so I think what's important to emphasize, and again, an important distinction to some degree, is, when you're sort of talking about how the work of Sea Shepherd has historically been perceived, even by conservationists, people looking at it and going, oh, okay, that's violent. That's maybe something that we don't want to engage with too much. There's an idea that this could be a slippery slope. But the whole ethos of Sea Shepherd and Paul Watson's current group, the Captain Paul Watson Foundation, is specifically that of aggressive nonviolence. So aggression and direct action is tolerated, but it's very strictly that they are a nonviolent organization. And this is in some way really shown through just the Sea Shepherd flag, which has this trident and this shepherd staff. And Paul Watson has always said this symbolizes force, but also protection. And that protective quality is one that has regard for all life, including human life, and as well, of course, the life in the sea, which the groups are dedicated to protecting. So that whole ethos is something that I really admire, and I think it's something that has drawn me towards these organizations, from the time I really got involved with environmental activism, because I found myself, even, as a teenager, just really frustrated at times by the fact that so many environmental groups were, out protesting, sometimes with that causing, more harm than good, depending on, their methods, or just really bloated organizations that are not, really walking the walk. They're very good at talking the talk, but not walking the walk. And with, groups like Sea Shepherd historically, and now Paul Watson Foundation, you're right to point out they're very small organizations. And in that regard, I think they've been very responsible with the way that they use their resources, because very little of that goes towards advertising and things like that. It goes towards really the campaigns. And, as you noted, the proof is really in the pudding. And I think when we look at whaling specifically as an issue, it's quite incredible when you look at the numbers, just the fact that the amount of whaling that was going on in the 1980s, before the moratorium on whaling, we've pretty much seen a 90% reduction in illegal whaling since that time. And I would argue, and the argument, put forward in the book and the discussion of whaling as a case study, is that this is not due to the fact that the International Whaling Commission put a moratorium on it. It's largely due to the efforts of groups like Sea Shepherd. And I would even say it's not so much because of the physical acts that they undertook against some of these illegal whaling vessels. It's very much as you were saying about the attention that they drew to the issue and
Hmm.
rendering something that was occurring in the high seas where no one can see it, rendering that visible, and then the public outrage that comes from that. And Paul Watson has very often said, the most powerful weapon that he and his groups have is a camera. And yeah, I think that's really one of the most powerful things they've been able to do. And um, on the whaling front specifically, but
100% agreed.
just yeah, to address your sort of question or comment about how the focus has turned more towards illegal fishing now. It's
Hmm.
yeah, largely because whaling's not as much of an issue anymore. We really only have three nations in the world that are still whaling to some degree, and not so often in the Southern Ocean, though that's always a threat.
Right.
Whereas illegal fishing has really become the main problem that we see, over harvesting, and of course the fishing of at risk or endangered species. And certainly Sea Shepherd's work alongside Interpol to catch the Thunder, as well as I think it was the Thunder and about 7 other illegal fishing vessels that were hunting the toothfish in the Southern
Right.
Ocean, which is technically a protected species, resulted in the longest sea chase in history, 110-day sea chase. But it resulted in the effective capture of these vessels, and that was something that Interpol was trying to do for over a
Hmm.
decade. And then
Yeah.
they hired Sea Shepherd basically to carry this out on their behalf, and the work was completed in under a year. And there's a really great book about this, called Chasing the Thunder, if anyone's interested in hearing more
Yeah.
about that. But I address it a little bit in the book, just as
Yeah.
one of these examples where yeah, Sea Shepherd at the time worked in some way as the police force. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's interesting, the relentlessness of that chase, the relentlessness of Sea Shepherd over the years. No matter what, it's definitely has its grassroots support from a lot of its volunteers, from a lot of its supporters, even from like Interpol, as well as people like academics like yourself, to be able to be like, let's highlight the work that they're doing, because they have been effective in being able to catch a lot of these players that people have been trying to catch for years.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen countries go to very big extremes. Indonesia were blowing up illegal fishing boats, for a while. People are tired of it. We've seen documentaries on it. We've seen the outrage that come from those, people watching those documentaries. People are like, why can't we why can't we stop this? And there's direct action that Sea Shepherd takes on the ground or on the water, for all intents and purposes, to be able to grab and be able to catch these people, these that are doing illegal things. And it's not just that they're catching fish; it's the way they treat their crew, the way they, we've talked on this podcast a lot about fishery slaves and how devastating that can be, and how they're treated, and how they're basically misled to come on the ship, and they're not returned to their families, and they're left on islands, and in cages. And it's awful things. There's one thing about catching these horrible people and horrible companies that are doing this type of work. The other thing is trying to prosecute them. And this is, I believe, where your expertise comes in. I've documented, stories where, when boats are finally caught, trying to go through the paperwork and trying to find the people who are really responsible, the companies. Sometimes, a lot of times, they're hidden behind numerous and layers of shell companies and paperwork, and they're being pinged all over the world, and it could be organized crime, and it can be all these different types of things. Can you just talk about, just like introduce us to the barriers of, like, saying, like, capturing a boat like Thunder, and trying it from an enforcement perspective, trying to prosecute the people? How does that all work? Is that an international law thing? Is it within the country they're caught? Can you just kind of give us a basis of what happens after a ship like the Thunder, or any other ship that's caught illegally fishing? What happens to them afterwards? Like, what's the process?
Yeah, so you're correct to point out that in some way, actually, seeing justice served for those who are organizing all of this is very difficult. And unfortunately, it's more often just those who are on the fishing boat and those who are directly involved who may face some charges. So, in the case with the vessels with the Thunder, they were returned to domestic countries, the closest ports, in some cases to Spain, and then charges were laid there. But it's not necessarily the case that those who are, let's say, pulling the puppet strings and, organizing all this to begin with are going to face justice for that. And very often, especially these illegal vessels, are tied to organized crime. And that's why it's so opaque and sheltered. It's not as though it's going to be easy to track those people down because they're covering their tracks. So
Yeah.
it's again one of those situations where we do the best we can to see justice served to a degree, but then there are also just these realities that make it, in some way very difficult to, ensure that the people who should be caught are. So,
Yeah, and I think the frustrating part is sometimes when you see them get away with it, and it's in very much like you see in tradition. I'm going to call it traditional organized crime, where, like here in Canada, for instance, in Ontario, where you're seeing a string of car thefts. I think it's across Canada. We're seeing car thefts, and then the cars end up shipped halfway across the world within like 48 hours. There's been news on it and things like that. But the people who are stealing the cars, like on the ground, are underage, minors.
exactly.
And they get caught. And they're the ones that get caught. They'll go to jail, but because they're going to juvenile court and juvenile, they get out a lot faster. And these organized crimes, syndicates, understand that, where they can get younger people. This has been going on for not just with car thefts, but like with any kind of. They get people who will get off easy, and they're like, yeah, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. You'll get all this money. We'll get you all this stuff. But you're the ones who are going to go to jail.
Yeah.
It's just like the fishers. If you think about it, they're the ones who are going to jail. The people who are really profiting are the people way above. And it's a difficult thing to do that. What is it within the law for fisheries that is that barrier to go after the people who are really making the money off of these things?
Yeah, it's mostly to some degree finding out, tracing actually like that paper trail, which may just not exist.
Right.
But then, at the same time, it's more a question of, who was actually on the ground committing the crime. And, this was actually an issue to some degree that came up in Paul Watson's recent detention in Greenland, because that occurred because Japan had put out a warrant for his arrest on the basis that there was a Japanese crew member who was injured during a Sea Shepherd campaign in 2010. And, while the facts of the case are disputed and Sea Shepherd, says they have footage that shows that no one was hurt, in the end, a very major reason why this was actually thrown out to some degree is because Paul Watson was not on the ship. He was not involved directly in this. And so, there were many reasons. And at the end of the day, Interpol, determined that the nature of the charges were political in nature, and they've even since completely suspended and actually fully gotten rid of the red notice against him. But just this sort of factual piece is very important when it comes to laying any kind of charge. It's who was actually the one pulling the trigger, so to speak. Right. So
well, and that whole thing with, unfortunately, Captain Paul Watson, no matter what people think of him, whether they think he's a controversial figure or anything like that, he has been the sacrificial lamb of the movement that he has inspired and created. But it's not like this last one. I think it was a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, where he was captured in, I think was it Greenland?
In Greenland, yeah. He was detained in Greenland based on this Japanese warrant through Interpol.
And it's not the first time. I think the last time was in Germany or somewhere because of what happened in Costa Rica during a filming of a different documentary during Sharkwater. He has been the sacrificial lamb, and I think people, they want to take the person who's got the publicity, especially in these movements, such as Paul Watson, or even Greta Thunberg when she was, and people like to put her down, like put them down. In the case of Paul Watson, they wanted to incarcerate him. They're hoping that that will stop the movement. Little do they know that he's inspired many, like millions of people around the world, whether people like it or not, to stand up. And he is the face, but he's not the people doing the work that are taking these ships and following these fisheries and making sure of that. So I think that's really interesting. The relationship with Sea Shepherd and Interpol, and looking at that law, going from Pirates of the Sea for Sea Shepherd, and working with law enforcement to help law enforcement get who they want to get, or try and get who they want to get. Does that transfer well over into the courts after, after this is all, like when they capture somebody like this? Because Interpol, you would think, would be able to make a case. They have the resources, the connections, maybe informants and things like that, to be able to look up the line. Sea Shepherd does its work by following, but they could only do so much, right? They're not enforcement, like legal enforcement. They can just follow people and let Interpol know, and let the enforcement people know. After a ship is caught, that relationship with Interpol, do they help build the case, and then for the courts to go after the people, and maybe even higher? I assume that's what they're trying to do, is not just go after the ship, but go after the owners, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah, certainly. And just that, really having that relationship with Interpol, I think, you can make an argument that it has afforded groups like Sea Shepherd a greater sort of protection and also legitimacy on the international stage. But what I would sort of say was almost the hinge for that, and what I think, perhaps this is speculative on my part, but what I think, perhaps allowed Interpol at some point to work with Sea Shepherd in this sort of way, was because Sea Shepherd was already sort of shifting from being a pure independent actor and direct action group to one that was also working with nation states and
Mm-hmm.
working as a sort of quasi state actor. And I think, especially, starting the sort of 2000s, through these sort of cooperative agreements that they had with states, gained, sort of more legitimacy in that regard, and probably at some point, led Interpol to thinking, well, we could have a similar arrangement with them. The way, you can sort of conceptualize it in maritime terms is that, there's a sort of a shifting role from being pirates to being privateers, who have,
Yes.
been hired to some degree. So
The musketeers of the ocean, and you can say, right?
exactly,
That once you mention that, you're right that these international agreements have become really important for Sea Shepherd. I've seen it in, I've documented in the Sea of Cortez, or the Gulf of California, where they're working with the Mexican government to help protect the vaquita and the Toto Alba. Which is kind of cool to see. They're monitoring, making sure that people are not using gill nets, because the Mexican government can only do so much, right? And that's the thing it adds is, does the relationship, between an organization like Sea Shepherd or any other organization and governments like this, does it strengthen international law, or does it undermine it? Like how well does that relationship help, go after these people who are doing bad things on the high seas, like in international fishing?
Yeah, I would say it certainly strengthens international law because it gives it teeth, and it
Mm.
gives governments who are willing, who have the willingness to actually enforce these laws, the teeth, the resources to do so. And this is a major sort of theme that I explore in the 5th chapter of the book, is that, there are many reasons why nation states do not enforce international environmental laws. It's often because they lack the means. It's sometimes because, as well, they lack the political will. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, this question of means and resources, can be resolved through working with groups like Sea Shepherd or the Captain Paul Watson Foundation. And it also allows them to a huge degree to get around conflict that they may not want to engage in. And This was the case for the Guatemalan government when Costa Rican vessels were illegally shark finning within their territorial waters. But they, as a government, of course, did not want to engage in some kind of conflict or aggressive, altercation with Costa Rican vessels. Even though it was within their territorial waters, there are many reasons why, states may not want to engage that way. And
Mm-hmm.
so at the
Mm-hmm.
time, Sea Shepherd was hired to basically, undertake that work on their behalf. So, um, yeah, the short answer to your question is that I think for many reasons, nation states are constrained, and that working with NGOs allows them to get past some of those constraints, whatever they may be. And yeah, it's sort of there's strength in those numbers and the using the diversity of tools in the toolkits. I think NGOs can to some degree be thought of as one of those tools and resources that nation states have, rather than needing to think of them as independent or siloed actors. So,
Yeah, very interesting. Uh, when it comes to organizations developing those relationships, have you come across any other organization that have had these, um, like I know Sea Shepherd's unique, and the Paul Watson Foundation is unique in terms of what it actually is able to accomplish. It has a lot of support because it's able to, like, ships. We all know ships are not cheap to maintain or even purchase. But are there any other organizations out there that are working with with governments to have the same type of relationship or a similar type of relationship where they're taking direct action in terms of monitoring? Because like Sea Shepherd has definitely taken a back seat to the more aggressive tactics that they were known for in the Southern Ocean when they went for the whaling. They're more of just like an observe and follow and observe, right?
yeah.
Sort of organization. Are there any other organizations that you know of through your master's work that have been trying to establish a similar type of tactic?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a cooperative agreement for something like monitoring, there are many
Mm-hmm.
organizations that are working with governments, to sort of strengthen, their abilities in those ways. But mostly what I looked at, through my master's thesis and the subsequent research on the book was looking more at those aggressive tactics that have been
Yeah.
used by NGOs, and in that regard, looking at that as a unique sort of strategy. Yeah, there is a part of the book where I sort of go through all the different marine organizations and the nature of the work that they're doing. And just as you've noted, also, talked about how Sea Shepherd has to some degree moved more towards that approach. And as time has
Mm-hmm.
gone on, is less and less, using those direct means. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And what, so when you did your master's thesis, I know a lot of it's based on the work that Sea Shepherd has done. What made you want to collaborate with Sea Shepherd to really, like, what made you so interested in the work that they did? What made you want to work with that organization and follow and essentially document what they've done from like how direct action is being used?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think it was to some degree born out of a bit of frustration with other environmental organizations that I just, yeah, did not feel were really acting on their message a lot of the time. And was very involved, with many different kind of environmental groups when I was, in my teens and early 20s, and really found Sea Shepherd and their approach at the time to be very unique and very important. And, coupled with the sort of activist work I was doing, I was also, of course, studying law and was
Mm-hmm.
really focused on international law, and whether it was international environmental law or looking at international human rights law, there was always this question of there's a lack of enforcement. It was almost like every single core issue we were dealing with in international law came down to that. And um, this sort of theoretical distinction, or this always ongoing discussion in international law of should we take an institutionalist approach, which
Mm-hmm.
kind of views the courts and treaties as being helpful and legitimate, or do we take a realist approach, which just sees international law as basically a game of power politics? And I was always a lot more swayed to some degree by that latter approach, the realist
Right.
argument. And really saw Sea Shepherd was a group that was very much functioning within that kind of reality, was saying, okay, yeah, we have laws and we have treaties and we will act as enforcers of them, but we are not going to, you know, leave this up to, the nation states to enforce
Hmm.
because they're just simply, not taking on the work. And so I think, yeah, those are the two kind of main things that led me towards them. And then really what, yeah, has made me believe in, the work of, Paul Watson and his groups over the years has just been their efficacy, just the
Yeah.
fact that they have produced results in terms of marine protection. So,
Right. It's funny. I come from a background where I want to see change. We share the frustrations where you see, governments continuing to fail to, enforce action on international treaties, enforce action on laws, or go a little too soft on some companies or characters more than others. But I'm always challenged when I hear, the reputation of Sea Shepherd and what the way their methods of their confrontation and activism, very unique. Not a lot of organizations take it on. It can be considered quote unquote controversial.
yeah.
And as a human being, I'm like, but they get, a lot of times they get stuff done. But as a scientist, I'm often challenged by how it helps conservation. And it almost challenges me, like, from a thought process of, like, is this the way to go? Is this something? And I'm always back and forth on that, because as a human, I want to see action. And sometimes this direct action actually follows in something, and you get people caught, and you get, like, this whole sort of documentation of it, like you said at the beginning of this interview, where there's a camera on it and people are like, oh, I didn't know this went on, and people are slaughtering marine mammals left, right, and center, and we thought this was done. We didn't think this was still going on. And you get that, that coverage of that from yourself as a legal scholar. How has the confrontation and activism challenged you as a legal scholar and your thinking as a legal scholar in any kind of way? Or how has it changed, or even how has it affected you as a legal scholar in terms of the work that you do through your master's, even now through your PhD, looking at, like, confrontation and activism, just like Sea Shepherd has done in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I understand, your perspective, looking at it from a scientist perspective and, looking at how that challenges in some way your view on things. And it's been very similar for me coming from a legal perspective on this, because I think the main thing is that on its face, it may seem like these kinds of methods are mutually exclusive to law. But in many ways, that's the argument of the book and the legal conclusion that I've come to, is that they're not incompatible, actually.
Mm.
And rather than being incompatible, it's actually very necessary to have groups like this undertaking this work, because, there's a sort of idea that laws without enforcement aren't worth the paper they're written on. And,
Yeah.
that's kind of the legal maxim that underpins the book. And, at the same time, having to acknowledge that, as I said, there is a potential for the kind of slippery slope towards, vigilantism. And, what if that principle of aggressive nonviolence is not upheld? But, that's where in the fourth chapter of the book, I look at, kind of do a long view of different forms of environmental activism and look at this spectrum of, the sort of more pacifistic activism towards that which can be considered radical, which is sort of where I'd position groups like Sea Shepherd, that they're radical groups, but they're not, at the sort of furthest end where you can consider them an eco-terrorist, because eco-terrorism falls into a very different, legal category and definition.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a big problem, with this issue, and as well, just going back to the conversation about the seal hunt, is that so often these things are thought of in black and white terms, but there's actually
Mm-hmm.
many shades of gray. There's a whole spectrum of behavior and activism from a legal perspective, and if we are precise about what it is that we're supporting, it's certainly not incompatible with the law, and it can certainly, be used to, I believe, meaningfully conserve species from a scientific perspective as well. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, it's definitely interesting, to hear that perspective. I agree. I do think it's necessary to have groups like people who take direct action. We've needed Greenpeace went from direct action. They've gone a little more towards that policy approach now. Sea Shepherd seems to be again moving now towards that policy approach. It almost seems like an evolution of eco-activism, as we go through. Now it'll be interesting to see as Paul Watson gets the Paul Watson Foundation up and running over the last few years. I know he's got a couple of ships, or at least a ship, to do some of his work. It'll be interesting. He in itself is a bit of I guess an enigma of a figure in the conservation realm. A lot of people have misconceptions. He does interviews, but I feel like a lot of the interviews that are done publicly are very similar types of questions. So it's very difficult to get to know the man from those interviews. You've worked closely with him over the years. You've gotten to know him. What do you think the biggest misconceptions people have about Captain Paul Watson?
Yeah, I think that, I'd rather just say one of the main things that I admire about Paul is just his clarity, and his clarity on what needs to be done and acting from that basis. And I think from there, I think when people are very clear about something and they are willing to some degree go, to whatever lengths necessary to achieve that goal, the misconception that arises from that is, that person is acting irresponsibly, that, again, this label of eco-terrorist, pirate has been, something that, Paul Watson has very much been branded with.
Yeah, for sure.
But again, that's really not where I've seen he has been acting from. It's been actually, very much there's that clarity about what needs to be done, but, not to any means necessary, because, of course, there is the idea that that limit is on physically harming other human beings, but, that property is fair game, right? So I think that
Right.
because he's such a visible figure, because, of course, the Sea Shepherd flag looks like a pirate flag, and to a huge degree, whale wars helped to kind of solidify that image and show him as a very controversial figure. I think people, again, think of him in these very black and white terms, but I think he's just an individual who's very clear about what his goal is and what he's willing to do that. And in that regard, he, I think, doesn't care so much about being vilified, and maybe doesn't take, as much care to have a very, soft public image. To some degree, it's more just about, am I getting it done? And,
Yeah.
yeah,
I can see that. I can definitely see that.
Not trying to perform a certain way that makes it palatable for everyone in the public. And I think he's someone who doesn't really care if he has enemies. He just cares about, am I achieving the goal of protecting marine life, marine mammals, the oceans. So, yeah.
Yeah, he's very. I see him. I can see him being he's not shying away from confrontation. Obviously, in the work that he's been able to do, even I've seen some of the interviews that he's done, and I respect that to a certain degree. He's fed up with the inaction. I see that as someone who's just fed up, and he's like, this is the action I have to take, and oftentimes with direct action, it's at a specific scale. It's like, I want to protect the vaquita, so we're going to send people there. I want to protect fisheries, which is a complicated issue, and he probably knows that action is not in and of itself is going to solve overfishing as a whole, but it's going to help, and it's going to show people that we can do stuff if we take action. And I admire that of him. Now, speaking of action, from a legal perspective, the High Seas Treaty came into effect, and I know it's still early. It just got affected into it just got ratified and put into practice January 17th of this year, 2026. Do you see that as a vessel that will really help? And I know it's still early and we still don't know exactly what can do, but for yourself as an environmental lawyer, what you've worked with in terms of direct action, um, especially with illegal fishing, where do you see this really benefiting? And what do you hope happens from this? And I'm not sure if you've had time to delve into all the intricacies of it, because I know it hasn't really been made completely public, but where do you see it going, and what are your hopes off of it?
Yeah, well, I think it is a major milestone. I'll just start by saying that, to have, finally a comprehensive treaty that is dealing with the high seas, it does, at least on paper, render the area less of a no man's land. It's on paper less of a Wild West, because when you
Hmm.
think about it, the fact that nothing like this existed prior, um, even on just terms of the Blackwater Law, is quite surprising. So this was a very essential step, and it's certainly a milestone in terms of working towards further protection on the high seas. And the I think it's very much just born out of necessity of this current moment, just given the extreme nature of the problems that we're facing on the high seas. But, at the same time, it's certainly not something that I see as a silver bullet. And
Right.
I think a bit of my own personal concern with it is that sometimes with these big, high profile treaties is this risk that they create a bit of a sense of closure for people, that okay,
Right.
we've created this treaty, and now we can be reassured that the problem is being fixed. But I would rather say that now is actually the moment where we need to actually be more kind of vigilant and looking at, well, what's going to happen with this now. um, and I've had a chance to look through it a bit, and I think that some of the positives are that it offers some um, access points for further NGO participation, in terms of, that it opens, things like consultations on marine protected areas, up to private organizations and NGOs. They're not excluded from the conversation on that, and nor are they excluded on environmental impact assessments. But at the same time, like while that's explicitly stated, and I do want to point that out as being something that's, in some way novel, because, treaties of the past so often have just regarded the nation state as the
Yeah.
main actor. But now, there's at least conversation about this. But um, yeah, the main sort of thing I have concerns about in terms of this treaty is just this requirement that's baked into it that it must not undermine existing legal instruments, which, to some degree, it's this catch-all that
Yeah.
kind of is like, okay, well, what does that mean? And can that just be applied in any situation, where a company might argue, okay, yeah, this is what the High Seas Treaty says, but it undermines this, treaty that we have, or this
Right.
trade agreement. And so it seems like there's potential for that to be used as a bit of a cop out.
Yes.
It's a structural risk, but yeah,
Yeah.
something I would also flag as well as the positives. So yeah,
It's a bit of a loophole in it. I mean,
exactly.
the
Yeah.
companies who are going to be brought to justice, or who will have to fall within these areas, will definitely use everything they can, as you probably know, to try and get out of this high seas treaty, whether it be a marine protected area, whether it be something else. And you when we see a treaty like this come out, obviously we can criticize it all we can, and it's just the first iteration of it. It'll evolve as we go. But it's good to point out these loopholes and these vulnerabilities in the treaty. As a treaty like this goes, evolves, how do people like, people like yourself or organizations, how do they work to change that as they start to see these loopholes come in, or potential loopholes come in, and try and make them a little harder to get out of, or make the wording a little better, and saying, hey, you know what, actually this treaty should, outdo any other, or something like that, any other law, instead of saying the other way around. How does that get changed over time?
Yeah, well, I think, as you said, you need to sort of see how, this first version ends up working. And if then there are clear cases and instances where, let's say, this loophole is just very easily exploited and that produces an outcome, usually on a case that would be one that's very visible. then the public outcry, the advocacy that would result from that could result in, the law being amended or changed. But these things, in my experience, they don't usually happen unless that issue is of major public concern. And, yourself as a scientist, I'm sure you're very frustrated a lot of the time that it's only the charismatic species that are highly visible that, get this kind of treatment, whereas there might be something that the High Seas Treaty implicates, like
Yeah.
a really important microorganism, for example, that no one is going to care to say, well, this is actually not being covered by the High Seas Treaty, but yet, if there's a whale or a seal, who's caught in the crossfire in some sort of conflict related to the High Seas Treaty, then it's much more likely that, that's going to produce outcomes. So that's something that we as advocates and lawyers also always have to be mindful of is, sort of having a flagship species
Yeah.
to represent the interests of many.
Oh, so
and
difficult. Yeah.
I think that's one of the major. I see that as one of the major pathways going forward is if there's just
Agreed.
a very visible issue. Coral reefs are of course an issue that I think many people are very concerned about. That's something that
Yeah.
could be used as a pathway, but it
Yeah.
won't really happen until there's like a test case that
Yep.
comes up. So yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that where this really becomes interesting is when we talk about deep sea mining.
Yeah.
Where we don't know what's on the bottom all the time, and a lot of the deep sea mining players, the CEOs that of these mining companies, are like, yeah, they've actually come out and said in the past, well, there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing really on the bottom of the ocean. Well, if you take samples, and we've seen it, there are a lot of like tube worms and all these things that probably are not iconic, and people, if they see it, they're like, oh my God, that's the scariest thing I've ever seen. But we don't understand, as scientists even, we don't fully understand their role in the deep sea processes, right? And what's actually interesting now, I'm not sure if have you ever heard of BRUVs? Like they're underwater video cameras that people use a lot of times in the shallows.
No.
And it's like a baited underwater, so they'll have bait there, and then you can see some of the predators or some of the fish that are along, and it's like basically GoPros. Yeah, it's used a lot in shark science, and we're seeing it a lot there. Now they're putting them in the deep sea. They're putting them in like 900 meters plus water. And we're going to start to see more of these come out as we understand the technology more and how they can work in the deep sea. And we're going to start to see these animals, more and more of these like sharks and other fish species that are probably on the bottom that we have never discovered before. And we're going to be able to see video of this. And so we're going to be able to discover that. But even then, they're in a very small area, especially in the deep sea where it's going to be dark. So you're going to see as far as light can take you. There's still a lot more, but it'll be interesting to see you talk about these iconic species. You talk about just understanding what species are in the deep sea, and with the pressure of deep sea mining now even becoming even greater with what the US is trying to do, it's going to be interesting to see how this develops and using, iconic species, even iconic habitats like deep sea hydrothermal vents and stuff like that. And we'll see how that goes. But it'll be like, I completely agree with you. It'll be interesting. We usually need like a whale or, a shark or something, that a sea turtle is something that people really want to see. We know that whales have used the deep sea before. They've gone down. We've seen them go down to very, very deep. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. But you're right. It's as a scientist, it gets frustrating. Like, don't just protect the whales, protect the invertebrates as well, because they play a role probably bigger than the whales.
Exactly. Well, that's the thing. They all play a role, and the interconnectedness of these ecosystems is something that we may never be able to fully explain definitively with science. But that if there's a piece of that that's removed, then the whole very delicate balance gets upset. And it's a great example. But when you're just saying how these companies come and they're like, there's nothing really important down there. These worms, they're just worms. It doesn't matter.
Worms. Yeah.
Like, well, okay.
Don't talk to an invertebrate zoologist like on that, because they'll be like, "What do you mean they're just worms? They're everything." I once had a teacher, professor who argued. He was a plankton biologist when he started out, and he once told everybody, he's like, "Whales mean nothing. They mean nothing." compared to what plankton mean to the ocean. And he was right, but he got people worked up about it because, I love whales. That's why I got into marine biology. He's like, yeah, but they mean nothing when you look at the overall functioning of the ocean. And you could argue that, but it definitely, it was very, talk about confrontational. It's very confrontational.
Well, it's a good sound bite, right? And
yeah.
Gets people
it gets
talking.
people's attention.
Yeah.
Absolutely. People who listen to this podcast are here to, they love hearing, what's going on in the ocean, how direct action. A lot of people support, Sea Shepherd and direct action, and they want to take action as well in their own way. For you, as somebody who's gone the law route, you've looked at direct action with Sea Shepherd and so forth. Where do you think, the everyday person's influence can matter most? Like, in your opinion, in your experience, looking at law, looking at direct action, where do you think, if you were to give someone advice, say, hey, I want to help protect the ocean, what advice would you give for someone to be like, hey, you know what, like, this is where your influence matters most?
Yeah. I actually think that as individuals, we have a lot more power than we actually might think we do. It's so easy under the current systems that we're in to just feel so swallowed by that and to feel like, everything I do is sort of meaningless. And I feel increasingly, just with the sort of doom narratives that we hear around the environment, that people are just becoming increasingly nihilistic about these things. And I don't, in that regard of how do you sort of not succumb to that nihilism, and how can you feel empowered? I don't think there's one specific thing that people can be doing, but I think there's an array of things, and that's, can range from getting involved with organizations, with, groups who are really doing the work, supporting them, through volunteering, through activism, to, of course, depending on what an individual's profession or areas of interests are, advocating for the ocean in those spheres, because really these issues are so often implicated, in many aspects of our daily life. But individuals may think, okay, well, I'm not a marine biologist, or I'm not a lawyer who's, focused on environmental issues, so there's nothing I can really do. But I don't think you need to be working discreetly on those issues to necessarily see, okay, well, there is something in my profession that I can, do, or open this conversation up in some degree. And aside from advocacy, aside from using one's professional connections, I also think that just the individual choices that we make in terms of the things that we eat, in terms of the places that we choose to travel to, can have a major impact. And, we can vote with our dollar to a very large degree. And, that's, I think not something to be underestimated. So, yeah.
Agreed. I think, it's interesting. I saw a pushback to that individualism, where you make these decisions, where we're stuck in a consumerism and materialistic world, where we buy, and everything is sold to you, and people make money by selling things. And it's interesting. Sometimes, it's the lack of paying for something, actively participating in not buying that extra thing that you would like, but you don't necessarily need. And I think that's a huge thing by speaking with your dollar, or not speaking by not spending, or speaking by not spending with your dollar, and understanding that, we are probably okay with the stuff that a lot of us are okay with the stuff that we have, and we don't need to spend on extra stuff because it's just extra stuff. I've always been in the thought, lately I've been thinking more about, imagine if I used my dollars to help fund a local project somewhere, a conservation project, instead of buying a t-shirt or buying a sweater that I may not need, or buy, like, I look at that, I look at what my daughters spend money on, and I'm just like, imagine, like, I said, this was enough for me to, like, go spend somewhere. We live in Canada. There's a lot of projects that need to happen in Canada, and funding is always necessary. Imagine if there was a commodity to just spend money just on that. And I think we don't understand, even though it's like maybe $20, $40, $100, and not a lot of people have that money, but we were willing to spend it on other things that we probably don't need, that are plastic driven, or that, like, it's a very, I've been in that thought process, still thinking about it, but it's been in that thought process, which I'll hopefully talk about in future episodes. But I completely agree. I think there's still a lot of power in as an individual, and what we can do and what we don't need to do to really get conservation moving forward. But Sarah, this has been so great to have you on. The Only Flag Worth Flying is the name of the book. We'll put a link to it here so people can purchase it. Highly recommend that people read it. I'm looking forward to diving more into it. I think it's a book definitely that we, as people who are interested in conservation, need to look at this perspective. Direct action is huge. We all love it. We all do love it. Even though there might be, we have our own thoughts on it, but it's something that we need more of. And it's I can argue that Captain Paul Watson is definitely a leader within his own right, in terms of trying new things, trying things that not many people thought of. A lot of people probably have hated on him in the past in terms of what he's done, but you have to respect what he's been able to accomplish over his years, and the work that he does with people like yourself, with people like Interpol, and what he's been through. It definitely deserves a lot of respect, and he definitely leaves a legacy in its own right, as that bit of a sacrificial lamb, in terms of what he's been able to put himself through and been able to accomplish. But it's allowed people like you to study what these actions have really caused, and especially on environmental law perspective. And I think it's really important. So I appreciate you writing the book. I appreciate your work, and I can't wait to have you back to talk about the seal hunt, your work with the seal hunt. It's I'm looking forward to that. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. It was, great to have the conversation today. And just one kind of last thing I just would say about all of it, is, as much as this conversation has been focused on direct action, and while the book is largely focused on direct action, of course, that third and sort of final piece that I explore in the book only, and didn't explore in my master's thesis, is just this idea, and I think we all feel this in the world we're in now, is just that the nation state is just becoming less and less relevant, and that
Right.
leaves a lot of
Yes.
space, not only for NGOs, but also for, indigenous groups, for corporations, for private actors in many ways. And, that's explored, but it's just kind of the final, thought I'd leave us with today, is just this idea, that the flag of the nation state is really not, the one that's flying so strongly or so high anymore, and that,
Right.
we see many different pathways forward in that, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this unfolds in the coming years. So yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That was awesome. Yeah, I love that thought process. We'll definitely explore more of that next time you're on as well. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Sarah, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on. Can't wait to have you on to talk about the seal hunt and your PhD work. Wonder if there's a book in that as well. I love the fact that she came out with a book for her master's. Like I said at the beginning of this interview, the book that I wrote with the chapters and everything is sitting on a shelf in the Acadia University library. It's something that, is precious to everybody who's written, because you never really write a book. It's not often that you write a book, especially a science one, or even an environment one or environmental law one like Sarah has. But to be able to put it out and add to it and really give the people what they need to know, and that's about enforcement in marine conservation on the high seas, on the ocean. It's a very difficult thing to do. It is something that is very important. It is the subject matter of a lot of things, especially the new high seas treaty that came into effect on January 17th of 2026. So, we got to talk all about that. I thought it was really good. I would love to know what you thought of of what we're talking about in the book. There's going to be a link to the book if you want to get it. But also, I want to hear what you thought of the entire episode, what you think of law enforcement on the high seas. Do you think the high seas treaty can help? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Let me know in the comments in the comments below this YouTube video. Or if you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app, let me know what you think. Go to speakupforblue.com/feedback. That's speakupforblue.com/feedback. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because like I said before in all my episodes, This is the start of a conversation. I'd love to continue it with you and just talk more about marine conservation, more about the ocean and how we can protect it. And that's the end of our episode. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us on today's episode. Can't wait to have you back on the podcast. And thank you for listening, everybody in the audience. Really appreciate you listening each and every time I publish an episode. That's it for today's episode. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, here from the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.